Good evening, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two further, just to let a few more people that are waiting in the lobby to be given access to the meeting. So we'll be with you shortly. It's just gone 2 minutes past 6, so I'd like to begin tonight's proceedings. It's my privilege to welcome you. I'm Scott Remy. I'm the director of the Southern Africa Food Lab, and I'm the host of tonight's event. And as you know, the topic for the discussion is building trust and democratizing decision-making across the food system.
Can't hear Scott.
Right. I beg your pardon? So while this is a relatively new way of meeting, we're very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the advisory board of the Southern Africa Food Lab, but indeed also Stellenbosch University, and more specifically the Faculty of Agri-Sciences, which acts as the convener of the Food Lab. The event is hosted in collaboration with the Law Trust Chair and Social Justice, and indeed the Development and Alumni Relations Division of Stellenbosch University. So before we start, I would like to share a few house rules, if I may. Please can we mute all microphones and cameras all the time? And we are going to be recording this talk. There have been requests for us to distribute it afterwards. Whilst the presentations are underway, please can you address your questions to the speaker in the chat section of the Teams? And from there, we will collate those and make them then available through the chairperson to ensure that when we have the question and answer session, we are going to keep to the 1 hour, 30 minutes strictly. And the speakers will each address us for up to 30 minutes. And after that, we're going to have the question and answer session. So now, in a way of context, I'm going to briefly share some information about the Food Lab and then indeed introduce you to the speakers. So the Food Lab was established 11 years ago to promote creative responses to the problem of hunger through multi-stakeholder dialogue and action. And we embrace a very distinct meaning of the word dialogue. So as my colleague, Colleen Magna from Reus Partner often reminds us, this is much more than an exchange of views or a debate, which is something I think more familiar to universities or perhaps through TED Talks. But it's something closer to the source of the word, deriving from the Greek word root of dia, which means through, and logos, which means the word or meaning. So it means through words we derive meaning. And so by drawing on this deeper interpretation, we see the definition can be expanded to include an emphasis on questions, inquiry, listening, and co-creation. So it's also about interrogating our own assumptions and those of others, to suspend judgment for a little while, and indeed to then search for truth or meaning. So it's these qualities that shape much of our discussions and indeed the conditions for dialogue to take place in a more reflective and dynamic manner. The lab has an advisory board which has important diversity. So it has stakeholders from corporate, grassroots, NGO, academic and government sectors, and we all try and work together to engage and transform the food system from farm to table. And it's in the context of the coronavirus that a very harsh light has been shone on many aspects of our society, especially our deeply racialized inequality and the failure to address social and ecological justice. And in particular, it's performing the same function with the food system. It's revealing many of its failings. So our history, of course, means that the needs of different actors in the food system are somewhat different. And the net result of this divergence is mistrust. And there's a lack of common voice and vision. In terms of governance, I think we could argue that COVID-19 has revealed that a centrally governed food system does not deliver on the right to food. And it has revealed a diversity of opinions and perspectives about what to do this. But it's also an opportunity. It's a starting point for a food system transformation that builds resilience at all levels. It requires actions that lay the grounds for necessary multi-level governance to improve engagements and the ability to cooperate across scales and sectors. So key questions are, what new forms of collaborative governance need to emerge? What do they look like? And how do we get there? And it's these that I hope that we'll be able to engage tonight. So I'd like now to introduce you to the chair of the session. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Sakani Ngomani, who will be moderating. She is Deputy Director General for Climate Change, Air Quality and Sustainability Development in the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fisheries. Prior to this, she was Deputy Director General in the Presidency in the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, and she served on the FoodLab board since 2016. She has extensive experience in terms of intersectoral coordination, so how the sectors of the state come together in order to address questions of food. So I'll now hand over to you, Dr. Ngubani, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for the introductions, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me?
Very well, Sakani. Thank you. Please proceed.
Yes, good evening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I want to take this opportunity to remind our guests to please ask their questions to the speaker via the chat function, from where I will put them to the speakers during the question and answer session afterwards. I also want to make a small correction in terms of the current role in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. I'm the DDG for Organizational Performance Management. A further reminder to all our guests to keep your microphones and cameras muted to ensure a good streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented in its global scale and impact. The situation is changing rapidly with many unknowns. The only area of certainty that we have is that the most affected are the poorest and vulnerable segments of our society. On behalf of the Southern Africa FoodLab and its visionary host, the University of Stellenbosch, our thoughts goes out to those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the devastating losses of life, we have already witnessed significant economic impact with massive job losses in South Africa, with people drowning further into the well of poverty, losing their ability to access and purchase affordable food. We have seen school closures, the implications for millions of young children who have lost their access to school meals. We're seeing a collapse in local markets and our vendor food system. The disruptions to the movement of farm laborers, farm growers and suppliers to grow food are revealing deep fractures in our food supply chains. We see food prices rising daily whilst millions of people are pushed deeper into extreme poverty and food insecurity. So without strong social protection measures, without sustainable economic stimulus packages and intersectoral collaborations, the public health impacts of food insecurity may be far greater than the disease itself. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that even before COVID-19, Statistics South Africa was telling us through their general household survey that persons vulnerable to hunger exceeded 13% under the fifth administration of our not so young democracy anymore. More than 22% of households reported inadequate access to food over this period. The South African Demographic Health Survey estimated in 2016 that stunting levels are around 27% amongst children under the age of 5. That is undesirable. We conducted evaluations at that time of nutrition interventions in the country through the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And those evaluations revealed the same dire states. But there is hope. What I want to reframe as a ray, a silver lining in this dark cloud. And that is that the right to food is entrenched as a constitutional mandate in South Africa. The National Development Plan has identified food and nutrition security as both a consequence and a cause of poverty and inequality, and it has to be dealt with in that manner. Goal 1, 2, and 3 of the 2030 UN SDGs are about ending poverty, hunger, and ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. We see South Africa's national policy on food and nutrition security, which also seeks to ensure availability, accessibility, and affordability of safe and nutritious food for all. The policy calls for intersectoral collaborations in the fight against hunger, malnutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies, and to build a functional food system to enhance the nutritional status of all South Africans. Recently, just this year in March, the high-level panel of experts on food nutrition security released a report. And in that report, I was fascinated or drawn to 3 key messages which they were sending to the coalition of the concerned with reference to elimination of hunger. First, that there's an urgent need for strengthening conceptual thinking around food security and nutrition to prioritize the right to food and to adopt a food systems analytical and policy framework. That monitoring reports on the SDG Agenda 2030 targets, especially Goal 2, reveals food systems that are facing a range of challenges, but also some opportunities linked to major trends in the drivers of food systems and change. So as we struggle facing this difficult period, we need to keep in mind the opportunities, some opportunities that are linked to the major trends in the drivers of food systems and change. The report thirdly tells us that policies, approaches, and actions for food security and nutrition will require critical policy shifts and support, a drastic shift in terms of support measures that enables or create enabling conditions that will uphold all dimensions of the food systems. Key amongst this is the basic understanding of the complex interrelated aspects of food systems and policies and actions that are necessary to uphold the right to food as fundamental and inseparable from social justice. In addition to radical transformation to deliver on the SDG, especially Goal 2, the report speaks of acceleration in the implementation of policies and innovative solutions if we are to ensure that global food system security is guaranteed for future generations. And lastly, it's a clarion call for stronger coordination and collaboration. And I want to underscore this as we go into the discussion, the stronger call for coordination and collaboration to ensure governments fulfill their own sovereign responsibility to feed their people. So the topic for this discussion, building trust and democratizing decision-making across the food system in a world in crisis, is befitting and timely. And without much ado, I am humbled to introduce you to our esteemed speakers. We have 2 excellent speakers that accepted this role today. Professor Thuli Madonsela is a law professor at Stellenbosch University, where she conducts and coordinates social justice research and teaches constitutional and administrative law. She is the founder of the Tuma Foundation, an independent democracy leadership and literacy public benefit organization, and convener of the Social Justice M Plan, an initiative aimed at catalyzing progress towards ending poverty and reducing inequality by 2030, in line with our National Development Plan and the Sustainable Development Goals. She is a South African that needs no introduction in platforms of this nature. Our second guest is Mr. Kevin O'Brien. He is a Group Sustainability and Risk Executive at the SPAR Group Limited. He is a member of the Risk and Social Ethics Committee at SPAR and co-chairs the Food Safety Initiative of the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, dealing in that role with issues relating to food safety, waste, and nutrition. In addition, Brian chairs the steering committee of the South Africa Plastic Pact and is a director of the SPAR Guild of Southern Africa. This guild provides a collaborative platform for independent SPAR retailers and wholesalers. He has served on the FoodLab board since 2016, and it has been my honor and pleasure to work with Brian. At this moment, I would like to take the time to hand over to Professor Thuli Madonsela, who's going to lead us in the discussion. Professor Thuli, you may unmute yourself. You have a maximum of 30 minutes to take us through the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, dear colleague, Ms. Ngamane, and thank you to the FoodLab for this timely conversation and for involving us at the Social Justice Chair. People think that revolutions come through intellectual mobilization. When you look closely at revolutions that have taken place, you will find that hunger has been at the core of the revolution. Therefore, whilst we're talking about building trust and democratizing decision-making across the food system in a world in crisis, I'm going to focus on the social justice dimensions of food security. From queues of hope to queues of food. Very recently, we had headlines on queues for food. If you look at the slide in front of you right now, you will see a snaky queue amid homes that are mostly shacks. That's a queue for food. If you think this is interesting, look to the left and see another queue when on April 27, we witnessed queues of hope, and I was a presiding officer. It was amazing the patience that people had standing in those queues, many of them voting for the first time, and many of them voting, having done this several times, but still hoping that this was going to be a moment of dawn. And a moment of dawn it was. So why are we queuing for food now? We're going to talk about that when we talk about COVID-19, which our colleague Takalani has been very elaborate in contextualizing the discussion we have in COVID-19. The right to food. As our moderator has said, food is a right of every human being. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects this right in Article 25, where it says everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and then other rights are stated. So key to today's discussion, which is about food security, is the right to food. And when we're talking about food security, as the food security lab would tell us, we're talking about sustainable supply of food. But if you look again at the universal right to food, it's not just the right to food, it's the right to food and nutrition. And you'll see that a lot of people often have to choose between hunger and nutrition. And a lot of diseases such as kwashiorkor, for example, are going to be experienced by children because parents do get food just to fill the stomach, and but not nutrition. The social justice commitment. I've just said that in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, food is a right. That right is replicated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11 of that covenant. And you'll find similar provisions in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. You will find similar provisions in SADC instruments. At the level of the Constitution, the right to food is protected under Section 27, together with other social and economic rights. And the right to food and nutrition for children is protected under Section 27. Therefore, this is a human rights issue. But just to reinforce that, we are one of a few countries in this world that has a specific commitment to social justice, which is about embracing the humanity of every person, reflected in equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. And this, of course, will be seen in, for example, a just and fair distribution of all opportunities, privileges, and burdens in society or in a group. So that's your right to social justice, which in our case is reflected in the preamble. And it is, if you look at the preamble, your next slide, it says, we therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And then it goes on and on and on. But the most important thing here is the link between healing the divisions of the past and the promise of social justice. And people often wonder, what is social justice? It is not socialism. It is not an anti-white male quest. It is really about embracing everyone's humanity and making sure that there's equal distribution, or just an equal distribution of all opportunities in society, all privileges in society, and all burdens in that society or a group. Now, food security in SCOPRA policy briefs. We have formed ourselves into a social justice and COVID-19 policy and relief monitoring alliance. The acronym is SCOPRA. Since April, we've been discussing these policy and regulatory responses to COVID-19, which is one of the greatest challenges of our time. And one of the things we pointed out to government was the issue of food security, and that it's a human rights duty, it's an equality duty, and that all policies that government was passing, or all regulatory responses to COVID-19 needed to firstly comply with the human rights duty in the Constitution and the equality duty as reflected in Section 9, rated with Section 7 of the Constitution, the preamble. But also, more importantly, that government should put constitutional duties first, key among those duties being those duties in the Bill of Rights and non-derogable rights. And the right to equality is non-derogable, the right to human dignity is non-derogable, and the link between food and human dignity is undoubtable. We've spoken today, we're talking very briefly about democratization of the decision-making process. So in addition to telling government to beware of putting the Constitution first and constitutional responsibilities first, we engage with government about the need to democratize. And that's not our suggestion that decision-making should be democratized. The Disaster Management Act suggests a democratized approach to decision-making. So firstly, government would have to use data analytics to predict in advance how each policy was going to impact on food security, or how each regulation was going to impact on food security. You need systems thinking to do this, because the policy or regulation itself would not be about food. It might be about something else. It might be about saying who should come to work and who should not come to work. Industry should be closed, but that has implications for food security. For example, closing of schools had implications for food security because children don't get food in some of their homes. They rely on one meal a day, which they get at their schools. And then when a decision was made to stop feeding schemes at schools, that had implications for food security, because that was the only meal that many of those children were going to have. But even if they were going to have a meal at home, they might not be able to bring that meal to school because of the stigma attached to poor kind of food. So they would have been able to eat it at home, but they're not able to eat at home now that they're school, but the school is not providing a meal. And we know now that a court case has been decided in this particular matter, and it was decided against government. But again, had government adopted the approach that is in the Disaster Management Act, some of these problems would not have happened, because you would have had multiple stakeholders making these decisions. In terms of Section 6 of the Disaster Management Act, you have an advisory forum. In terms of Section 5, you have all of the you have all of the provinces represented in the committee, in the intergovernmental committee that is formed to them. But I must indicate to you that there's also a link between food security and corruption. And we anticipated this, that there was going to be corruption in the food parcels, there was going to be corruption in the procurement processes, but there was also going to be indifference and incompetence. And again, a multi-stakeholder approach closes the gap when it comes to these matters, both in decision making, but also in leveraging social accountability to make sure that the right thing is done. Sadly, some of the suggestions we made in our policy briefs have seen improvements. We can't claim that we're the only ones who had made those suggestions, but we've seen some of the liberalization of the decisions. But we haven't seen a lot in matching decisions with food security. For example, we said instead of waiting until people call, government needed to deploy social workers to every street to make sure that everyone is accounted for in the 4,392 municipal wards. When the social edifice cracks, on the picture there, I have Balisa Musa. Balisa Musa was arrested at the age of 12 in 1976. She works hard today, but she doesn't have the kind of access to markets that those who were privileged to get in first into those markets have that kind of access. She struggles. She goes to Constitution Hill to talk to tourists about the fact that she was arrested in the women's jail there, and often gets some tips there, together with the money she gets from selling cheap cosmetics. Under COVID-19, all of that was stopped, and then she eventually had to eat her capital and she struggled. The Tuma Foundation is assisting her to start a sustainable business, and if you have any interest in helping her, she is the face that we borrowed for the Marshall Plan for Social Justice, which is called the Musa Plan for Social Justice. Okay, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all doom and gloom when it comes to the decision making and the social justice issues and food security. Just firstly, I have said food security is a right. And also that a lot of revolutions are not caused by philosophies, they're caused by hunger. In Zulu, we say hunger makes people angry. And so it's easy to whip people into action when they're hungry. I saw that when I was the pub protector, and when they started this white monopoly capital campaign, it was easy to leverage poverty to get people, to mislead people about what was going on and to try and detract from the state capture investigation. So what's in it for us is we really need to think carefully about food security, and we need to beg government to come to the party to democratize decision making, so that we can have all hands on deck, but also multiple eyes to look at the problem. And I also think that when we have all hands on deck, we're going to have the kind of transparency that allows sunshine to be the best of disinfectants, as Justice Brandeis once said. How do we get that sunshine? For example, if we had the structures under the Disaster Management Act, I don't think people would be sitting in a little corner issuing all of those tenders, and these tenders going in the wrong places, and these tenders being overpriced, and possibly false billing is taking place. Transparency, multiple eyes, creates transparency. So what are the glimmers of hope? The glimmers of hope is that people are suing. So one of the of our solutions is lawfare. So we've seen when it comes to food security, people resorted to court, and food was provided to schools. But as I indicated, food security is both about access to food, which is stopping hunger, but also access to nutrition. And what undermines food security is often affordability of food, and in some cases, it's the movement of food. In South Africa currently, the main problem, now that we're on stage level 3 of the COVID-19 lockdown, the creation of food per se is not a problem, but it will eventually be a problem, because people can only farm food if they can sell it and make a profit. So if eventually they can't make a profit, we're going to start experiencing problems with food security, because people may have to abandon farming and probably turn their farms into lodges or some other infrastructure. So what are we to do going forward? On me, in front of us, I have a slide. It was supposed to have 2 boys. I think I lost the second boy, Stephen from Kenya. But there are 2 ways that I think we need to go forward with this food security issue. The one is the one proposed under the Social Justice M Plan, which is let's make sure that we leverage data analytics for better policy making. And we're not, again, the first people to say that. The government's own SEARS, social and economic impact assessment systems, requires the use of data to predict how this regulation, policy, or plan is going to impact on social and economic rights, and food security is an economic right. Our own suggestion under the M Plan suggests a 9-dimensional instrument that I'm not going to elaborate on, but it's put human rights first, put equality duty first, social justice first, and leverage data analytics before you go through these policy decisions. For example, we've discovered long after a decision was made that it was harming people, harm them in the virtual space first, so that when you finally implement in the real space, you have adjusted. But in the event you can't adjust, you have to make that policy. You have to harm people, whether it's in terms of production of food or access to food, you have to harm them. What we then say is implement your policy together with your compensation strategy. So instead of saying we're going to harm you now and later we're going to come think up a plan of how we're going to compensate you, that's not a good approach. So that's government side. But as part of the M plan, we're also saying all hands on deck. That's me, you, and everyone else. And examples I have here are two boys. The other picture somehow fell through. One is Keone Ching in America, who addressed the food security problem of little kids at schools in America. There was the shaming of little kids. This is 8-year-olds who were being shamed by grown-ups because their parents had not paid for lunch money. And this little one sold key rings at $5 and raised about 5,000 US dollars for his own school and other neighboring schools. So that's me, you, and we can do the Leone Ching way. In Africa, we have Stephen, I've just missed his surname, from Kenya, who has dealt with the water issue, the hand washing issue. That's just an example. Food security is also about food that is not contaminated. So food, access to food, access to nutrition, and access to quality food. He made sure that he created this lovely machine that is pedal operated. He's again about a 9-year-old, meaning we can really help these little ones, and that is encourage innovation within our own backyards. Firstly, just to say thank you to the FoodLab and to the Stellenbosch community. It is a difficult time, but the Chinese say that in times of crisis, the symbol they use is a symbol of both danger and opportunity. Yes, it's going to be painful, but it is an opportunity to relook at how we govern, to really look at how we include everyone, but also to really look at how do we leverage our ability to innovate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Madonsela, for that wonderful presentation. We will move immediately to the second presentation by Brian, and then take questions. But just to guide your thought process as Brian presents, I'd like you to be thinking of this particular question that has come through, and that is, what practical steps can be taken to build trust across formal and informal sectors? And what is it that needs to be done to deepen trust between the state and the private sector? Just food for thought. Brian, over to you. You have 25 minutes tops. Please unmute yourself. Can the technical team help unmute Brian?
Sorry, Kevin, can you hear us? I think you're on mute. So if you could just unmute yourself, Kevin. Are you not on mute? Right, we do have a technical issue. Let's just try to get Kevin on unmuted. One moment, please. Thank you.
Whilst we do that, I'd like to take this small window of opportunity to just highlight the wonderful phrases that Professor Madonsela has put before us. This issue around hunger as a core driver for revolutions. We have seen that in South Africa, where the riots are driven by extreme experiences of poverty, food insecurity, a struggle for water rights and all that. And this, besides happening irrespective of the provisions in our Constitution and the Universal Declaration on the Rights to Food. I was fascinated, and I would like to get your comments on the notion of, given that we're talking decision-making to inform policy, the notion of democratization of the decision-making process. To what extent do we think we can advance further the system thinking in our current decision-making processes, and do so in a manner that will foster more accountability, that will match decision-making with food systems, that will give voice to the local citizens, even children, localized action, as we have witnessed in the shared experience by Professor Madonsela of a 9-year-old in Kenya and a young boy in the US. How do we ensure that we have multiple eyes that promote collaboration, that ensures there's sunshine even in the darkest corners of our country? Rhymes? Kevin?
Whilst Kevin is trying to be reconnected, colleagues, it's Sean here from the Alumni Division. Just to say thank you so much for that. I think just to reiterate, if you could, all the other attendants could turn off their cameras and mute themselves, so we can get Kevin on the screen and we can hear him. That would be highly appreciated whilst we think about these issues. And if you're thinking about your question, I already see a few. I see one from Michelle Williams and other colleagues. Please type them in the chat bar. And hopefully, Kevin, we would be able to hear you. And there we go. So
thank you. Okay.
I'm so happy to hear your voice, Kevin. Over to you. You now have 20 minutes.
Me as well. Not that that's awfully important, but as long as you can hear me. Sorry, can I?
We can hear you. Proceed, Kevin. We can hear you.
Okay, great.
We see your presentation as well.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I guess just to start off with, and the context of my discussion, obviously rooted in what's on the slide at the moment, and Tsakani, you made reference to this when you opened this discussion, but I think it's really important to particularly look at the last sentence. This relates to new forms of governance that is transparent, adaptive, collaborative in order to achieve cross-cutting coordination between different societal actors. So good evening to all of you. And I'm sorry that I seem to have lost myself for a brief while there. And it's just what an incredible privilege for me to have been asked to present at this webinar. I'm humbled, to be honest, to be in the presence of the two colleagues, Professor Madonsela and Dr. Ngomani. So maybe to head straight into my presentation. The thread through my presentation will emphasize four main issues: purpose, trust, leadership, and collaboration. I've tried to embed these into the presentation and will not be dealing with them as separate areas of consideration. They have to, in my opinion, lie meshed in the fabric of how we can find a sustainable future for our society. Way back in 2010, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development published research entitled Vision 2050, the New Agenda for Business. The research contemplated a world in 2050 where 9 billion people would live well. They describe living well as a standard of living where people have access to and be able to afford education, healthcare, mobility, the basics of food, water, energy, shelter, and consumer goods, all within the limits of the planet. The paper looks at how business, civil society, and governments have to work together to improve the system in which we live,
not individual parts of the system, but the entire system. During my master's studies, I was honored to be in the presence of the Dalai Lama, and he had many profound things to say, and one I'll never forget, and I haven't used these words, but they went along the following. You people at business schools are taught the art of negotiation. You're taught how to prepare your arguments, research your topics, formulate your plans, your plan A, your plan B, your plan C. However, listen to yourself. They're all your plans. Where is the negotiation or compromise in that? Very sobering words that go to the very heart of why I believe we struggle with the concept of true collaboration. We are wired to enter discussions with a preconceived idea of what we want out of the discussions. We operate in a complex food system in South Africa, and it's a damaged system. All stakeholders in the system need to collaborate to improve the system. Business is particularly challenged by this, as the competitive, profit-driven ethos of traditional business often means that business struggles with the concept of the greater good, preferring self-interest as a driver. Similarly, governments and community-based organizations need to grapple with self-interest as opposed to the greater good. Many years of mistrust as a result of self-interest and the lack of transparency has created fertile ground for those organizations and individuals who believe in true collaboration to resolve age-old conflicts. Systems thinking and an obsession with rebuilding trust is the basis for effective collaboration. And this brings me to the second slide I'd like to share with you. It's a very interesting slide, and I wish I could spend a lot of time going through it item by item, but we don't have that time. But the slide shows the shifts that need to take place within business, governments, civil society, and anybody that wishes to deal with the big issues that face our society. Various organizations are at different levels of understanding or operating within the parameters set out in the slide. However, purpose lies at the heart of the change we need to make to build a future where all people live well. Purpose is about the why, not the how or the what. We find ourselves in the current dilemma across the world because we have for many years focused on the what and the how, because that focus allegedly makes us better than others, and we have equated success to that single concept, although we struggle to acknowledge that. The slide gives us an indication as to the levers we need to use to create a governance structure that is collaborative, so that the important blend of concepts contained in both sides of the slide are mixed in such a way that we can deliver sustainably on our collective purpose. Simon Sinek, in his 2019 book, The Infinite Game, stated, and I quote, "It is well within our power to build a world in which the vast majority of us wake up every single morning inspired, feel safe at work, and return home fulfilled at the end of the day. The kind of change I advocate is not easy. With good leaders, the vision can come to life. Great leaders are the ones who think beyond short-term versus long-term. They are the ones who know that it is not about the next quarter or the next election. It's about the next generation." South African FoodLab advocates social innovation labs to provide spaces for transformation and collaboration. These innovation labs have three core characteristics. Firstly, they must be social and bring together diverse actors. The building of trust during this phase is critically important. Secondly, they must be experimental and ongoing. The collective works in an iterative manner, showing commitment and resilience. And thirdly, they must be systemic, in that they need to explore the root cause why things are not working. An understanding of systems thinking is core to the success of this phase. Of utmost importance to the success of these labs is the commitment by the collective to suspend judgment and to open their capacity to engage as listeners. Not too different to the wise words of the Dalai Lama. However, there is one very important consideration that needs to be clarified up front with the collective for these labs to be truly successful and impactful. And that is purpose. If participants in the collective do not connect with the why, the issue being considered is important to them, the collaboration will fail. The pursuit of purpose is fundamental in providing business, governments, and community-based organizations with the guiding star to true collaboration and ultimately sustainable ways to bring about permanent change. In keeping with its belief in transformation and collaboration, the South African FoodLab embarked on a collaborative and transformative initiative in eThekwini. The objective of this initiative arose out of the fact that COVID-19 had revealed the ongoing and currently acute fragility of the South African food system. The South African FoodLab established a dialogue to action platform in eThekwini to enable a deeper understanding of the issues and facilitated a response to the crisis. A number of guiding principles were identified, and most importantly, a clear understanding of the system that is currently in existence in eThekwini was carefully researched and understood by the inclusion of relevant stakeholders, beneficiaries, local governance structures before progress could be made by the collective when considering what action to take. COVID-19 has brought to the fore issues which have been fundamentally wrong in our society for many years. Some of us chose to be blind to these issues, and now they have hit us like a train without a light in a tunnel. This has exposed the deep fragility of our food system, our corporate culture, our societal faults, and our government weaknesses. Most of all, it has exposed just how weak our leadership is in business, in society, and in government. Early in April, I read an article which amplified in my mind the way in which many of us have chosen not to acknowledge the deep-rooted problems in our society. The article made reference to the fact that we across the world have in many instances allowed our civil liberties to be taken away. We've allowed our economic activity to be destroyed. We have allowed towns, cities, countries, and communities to be locked down. Why? Because we can hear the knock on our doors. The knock being that it could be us, our families, our friends who could get the virus and thereby face the consequences of being infected. The article goes on to ask the difficult question. Last year, as with every year for many decades, millions of children die of malnutrition. Why have we never taken such drastic action to address that massive issue in our society? In the words of Nelson Mandela, as long as many of our people still live in utter poverty, as long as children still live under plastic covers, as long as many of our people are still without jobs, no South African should rest and wallow in the joy of freedom. 18 months ago, I facilitated a review of my company strategy. Comprehensive research was conducted with all stakeholders. One of the significant changes to the company strategy was the formulation of the purpose. Company purpose is to inspire people to do and be more. Once this had been achieved, the process of reviewing the strategy was done within the context of the purpose. This resulted in significantly revised strategic outcomes, of which one is affordable and nutritious food. This outcome will only be achieved if my organization acknowledges that the outcome cannot be achieved by the organization operating on its own. It has to collaborate with other stakeholders, and yes, at times including competitors. A significant challenge for any organization. This process will need to include an acknowledgement by all stakeholders that their past actions have caused the problems in our current broken food system. Poverty and every person's right to nutritious food will never be solved by CSI and charity. Purpose and values are not negotiable. This is another significant challenge for organizations that are not clear on their purpose. Living your purpose and values until they become difficult to live by and then bypassing them creates mistrust and confusion. Individual purpose organizational purpose, and the collective purpose need to be aligned for collaboration to have a good chance of success. There is no value in forming relationships to organizations or people that don't have similar purpose. For food business, particularly food retailers, interact with millions of people every day through retail stores and food products. The responsibility of food retailers pursuing the common good has never been more important in South Africa. Courageous, curious, and activist leadership is needed within these organizations. Collective commitments to collaborate to reduce business impact on the environment, to create employment, and to pursue inclusive economy should be at the forefront of business's mind. During October 2018, the South African FoodLab, in collaboration with WWF in South Africa, published a paper recording and analyzing research that had been conducted during the previous 2 years. The paper is entitled An Appetite for Collaboration, Addressing Food-Related Health Challenges Through Collective Industry Action. The publication of the research culminated in the Dietary Transitions Food Systems Dialogue Workshop in March 2019, where stakeholders considered the outcomes of the research and identified a number of initiatives to collaborate on. The outcome of this workshop confirmed that there was indeed an appetite amongst the participants to collaborate. Most importantly, there was a commitment to honesty, transparency, and sincerity in the collaboration. However, the workshop also identified one of the biggest challenges to this collaborative action: the absence of government. The relevant government departments in South Africa are sometimes elusive when it comes to collaboration with private-owned enterprise. This, I believe, is mainly due to the justifiable lack of trust between government and business, and between business and government. The effects of apartheid and of the past 10 years in our country run deep. Positive impacts on our broken food system will be severely hampered if collaboration does not include government. This process has also uncovered just how difficult true collaboration is, as the parties to the workshop continue to grapple with making sustainable impact. What is clear from the research and the workshop is that the South African FoodLab is well placed to provide the collaborative platform for tackling the challenges of our food system. The unanswered question is whether business is prepared to be driven by a relentlessly driven purpose and thereby driven by the common good, or will business continue to be self-serving in its economic views? If it's the latter, unfortunately, we'll still be having these conversations in 10 years' time. Collaborative governance is, in my opinion, still a system of governance which is not clearly understood. The word governance is always used as the go-to word when we want to ensure that things are done properly, so that we can tick the box from a compliance point of view. The King Code of Corporate Governance has thankfully introduced over time a more sophisticated, fair, and accountable form of governance within business and other governing bodies. There are numerous other forms of governance that control civil society bodies as well. My concern with traditional governance thinking is that it has generally grown out of control thinking. As shown in my slide on transformation from profit to purpose, our existing governance structures are often aimed at ensuring that the profit side of the slide is monitored to ensure that ethics and fairness prevail, with a smattering of focus on transparency. In my opinion, collaborative governance should be born out of the purpose side of the slide, with a smattering of important issues from the profit side of the slide. In contemplating how this collaborative governance could look, I came across a paper prepared by Kirk Emerson from University of Arizona, Tina Nabachi, excuse my pronunciation, yes, Syracuse University, and Stephen Belloch, the State University of New York. The paper is entitled An Integrative Framework for Collaborative Governance. And Henlo, if you could maybe just move to my next slide, please. Relatively busy slide, and one that, again, one could spend a lot of time contemplating. Unfortunately, we don't have that. But this collaborative governance framework, in my opinion, is really important to try and understand. And so I'll try and take you through relatively quickly. The framework contains three nested dimensions that represent the general systems context namely the collaborative governance regime and its collaborative dynamics and actions. The outermost box, represented by the solid lines on that diagram, represents the surrounding systems context, or the host of political, legal, socio-economic, environmental, and other influences that affect and are affected by the collaborative governance regime. This systems context generates opportunities and constraints and influences the dynamics of the collaboration at the outset and over time. From the system context emerge drivers, which include leadership, consequential incentives, interdependence, and uncertainty, which help initiate and set the direction for collaborative governance regime. The collaborative dynamics consist of three interactive components: principled engagement, shared motivation, and capacity for joint action. I consider the above-mentioned components within collaborative dynamics as cyclical or iterative interactions. Many frameworks conflate systems, context, and conditions with specific drivers of collaboration. This framework separates the systems context from essential drivers, without which the impetus for collaboration would not be successful. As mentioned earlier, these drivers are leadership, consequential incentives, interdependence, and uncertainty. One or more of these drivers need to be present to initiate the collaborative governance regime. The participants to the principled engagement bring their set of values, their attitudes, interests, and knowledge, and in addition to the culture, missions, and mandates of who they represent. Once again, this shows the need to connect on purpose before true collaboration can occur. Principled engagement occurs over time through the iteration of four basic process elements: discovery, definition, deliberation, and determination. Through this process, the participants should develop a shared sense of purpose and shared theory of action for achieving that purpose. Shared motivation is defined as a self-reinforcing cycle consisting of four elements: mutual trust, understanding, internal legitimacy, and commitment. Once achieved, this will enhance and help sustain principled engagement, and vice versa, on a virtuous cycle. The collaborative governance regime.
As you wrap up,
Yes,
Kevin,
I will be a couple of minutes.
Yes, in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Collaborative governance regime must generate a new capacity for joint action that did not exist before, and sustain or grow that capacity for the duration of the shared purpose. This new capacity is the basis for the empowerment of the group, which can be seen as democratic principle underlying collaboration. So on a personal note, it's been challenging to bring my organization to believe that it has a role to play in changing the course of our future by positively improving the impact, positive or negative, that we have on our environment, our society, and the economic well-being of our people. Authenticity in our marketing approach needs to be carefully evaluated as we mature in being more purpose-driven. Leadership needs to be more skilled in the art of collaboration and needs to understand effective systems thinking. Transparency, innovation, and empowerment needs to replace secrecy, hierarchy, control, and obsessive planning. No single business, government department, community-based organization can solve this on its own. If a single business believes that it can, it needs to carefully consider its purpose, or it needs to acknowledge that it operates for self-interest alone. The future is the opportunity for those who are not afraid to be vulnerable, transparent, ethical, and relevant. Mistrust, greed, and self-interest have created the food system problems of our time. And Henlo, if you put my last slide up, please. To move forward, we all, to a greater or lesser extent, have to acknowledge that we have played a part in perpetuating a society that is devoid of trust, transparency, and moral courage. In some way, our actions have made us complicit in the failures we are now trying to rectify. George Orwell's quote, which is on the screen now, "Truth is treason in the empire of lies," is often the reason why we maybe stay silent. However, as I've said earlier, courage and vulnerability with those who share a common purpose will get us into a future state where we all live well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, Mr. O'Brien, for the wonderful presentation. The disadvantage of all this virtual meeting is that we cannot clap hands. You can't really hear us. We can open the video to show that, but it will mess up our system. So take this as a hand clap from all of us.
Thank you very much.
I also want to note that most of our esteemed guests, I'm sure I speak for all of you, wish you have had an opportunity to meet the Dalai Lama when doing your masters.
It was a great privilege. It really was a great privilege.
It was a great privilege. But we get a testimony of how the principles of leadership and collaborative governance, trust, leadership with transparency from the Dalai Lama has rubbed off on you, Kevin. So thank you for that. I would like to, in the interest of time, allow the panel members to respond to some of the key questions that have come from our esteemed guests. I had already placed into the room the voice of Michelle Williams in her question, just also to underscore the key question that she further expanded on. And she's asking, how do we make food a right when it is also a commodity? And this question actually brings out these issues around trust and collaboration. You cannot have what Kevin refers to as a collaborative regime without trust amongst the collaborators. So how do we go about that? I'll ask the panel members both to respond to that question. Secondly, I want us to try to respond to the question by Professor Danny Brink, where he's asking, isn't government approach to make decisions and take responsibility on behalf of its citizens? Is that not the right approach? And how do we then contribute to the creation of a culture of deepening these relations to ensure access to food or in the interest of food security? I see Professor Thuli's hand is up, and I'll take her first, and then Brian, and we'll take the next round of question time permitting. Professor Thuli, please unmute yourself and take the floor.
Can you see me? Right. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you to our colleague, Mr. O'Brien. That was quite insightful. The first question I would like to answer is the question of how can government both be decisive in governing and also be expected to be collaborative? And that's a good question. One of the accusations against President Ramaphosa was that he's not decisive. And I remember us discussing it within SCOPRA, that they want him to rule like an emperor. He is not an emperor. He is governing. And then the president stopped governing and decided to rule. And then now we're complaining again that he's ruling like us, like we children. So I think there has to be a kind of balance in that the government has to make agile decisions to keep up with the challenges that face nations. At war, you expect government to act decisively and not even to share information, because that information may go to the enemy. At the beginning of COVID-19, our government acted decisively because action needed to be taken. Consultations were taken, but they had to be done very quickly and decisions made fast. We've been under COVID-19 for 4 months. The whole world has been under COVID-19 for 4 months. And the challenge is, how do then, moving forward, how do governments bring citizens along? And I'll tell you why it's important to bring citizens along. It was in my letter to the president, and where I quoted the Little Prince, is when you understand the decision, it's easier to comply. And it's easier to understand the decision when you have been involved in the development of that decision. And what does it take for government to collaborate? I think it takes elements of not just government, it takes elements of us in civil society, people in business, knocking at the door of government and saying, let's do it together. The architects of the Disaster Management Act were thinking about collaborative government or collaborative governance, which is government and the people. And you can see that in that Section 5 is an intergovernmental committee. Section 6 is a structure that involves civil society, and it's a permanent structure. It's not an ad hoc consultation. What it does to bring everyone on board, it diminishes walls, it diminishes suspicion, and therefore it creates an atmosphere of compliance, collaboration, but it also crowdsources ideas. Just look at psychologists, emerging psychology around how brains operate. One of the things is we tend to gravitate towards people we feel safe with. And that's one of the reasons people discriminate. They tend to be homosocial, not homosexual, homosocial. They tend to go towards people who look like them, who think like them, who behave like them, because it feels emotionally safe to do so. Now, government, on the other hand, needs to recruit people who are not homosocial, people who are comfortable working with other people, and people who are comfortable working in diverse settings and who are able to deal with women, who are able to deal with people who are racially different from them, culturally different, class differences, etc. And they need diversity awareness to do that, and a sense of safety. From a Tuma Foundation perspective, we have a training that is called Epic Leadership. It trains leaders to be ethical in the way they do things right, do the right thing the right way, regardless of whether anybody is looking, and what are the chances of you being caught. The second thing is purpose-driven, and that's quite similar to the approach from our colleague Brian. Is purpose-driven is when you do something, you're thinking of the purpose. If, for example, working with you, Dr. Ngomane, is more likely to bring me to my purpose than working with my cousin, I will put my cousin aside for now and work with you because I am focusing on purpose. And the next one is impact conscious. Is think about, this is the systems thinking part of it, that think about one decision that you make here has implications for others. And again, impact consciousness drives you to collaborate because you know that whatever you're doing is going to impact on many people, and whatever they do too is going to impact on what you're doing. You therefore need them on board in what you're doing. And lastly is committed to serve. If you're committed to serve, you don't mind who gets the credit. Because in collaborative leadership, you need that kind of leadership that's not too much focused on the next election, as the colleague suggested. That is not even focused on who gets the credit. It's let's get there. Let this boat reach the shore. That it must reach a new port. It must leave the shore, and it doesn't matter who gets the credit, because the most important thing right now, for example, in South Africa, the most important thing right now is we limit infections and we end infections on COVID-19. Secondly, food. Secondly, we make sure that economically we all remain sound. But thirdly, that human rights are not compromised. And that's basically my contribution. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you so much for that response. You know, my way of sending a message later to time is just to show the face. Thank you so much. If Kevin can please take a bite to the questions raised, but I also want to in your response for you to be taking us to the way forward already, by as well addressing this issue. You asked how long, as long as our people live under plastic covers, as long as there's no life of purpose that Professor Tuli has just spoken to, and you mentioned that, this notion of collaborative governance regime could be something that's a challenge to conceptualize. So let's try to take on responses looking forward by answering some of the questions raised. How do we marshal production of nutritious food at every level of society? What policies and practices can we create to shift coordination, as Monica Basson is asking? So let's try to deal with that. It's difficult living a life of purpose, but how do we make it happen? Please.
Yeah, thanks very much,
Brian. Yes.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is, it is not an easy thing to undo a linear approach to life. To understand a system and to understand the importance of systems and the impact of systems is not easy, because what lies beneath the understanding of systems is an acceptance that not only you may find that there are differences that you encounter, but more importantly, it's your appetite to respect those differences. And I think that it is such an easy thing to sit around a table to try and deal with an issue in a collaborative, in inverted commas, and nod your head sagely that you understand what people are saying. But it's only when you respect what people are saying are you challenged in rethinking how you wish to approach the issue. And that's why for me, purpose is incredibly important. And we don't spend enough time. And that is, and I use this word, the social compact, and I need to be, I was going to introduce some thinking in my talk, but I chose not to because maybe I don't know enough about it. But when you consider, society, business, government, unions, and you look at how each one of those entities are so entrenched in a survival mode of how they perceive how they need to survive to be where they are right now. And this is not a reflection on any one of those stakeholders. You begin to realize that it's very difficult to sit around a table and want to and are expected to just wish those differences aside. But I think in my heart I believe that time needs to be spent with those people, with that group, with society, business, government, unions, to really look very carefully at purpose. Because once you have a common purpose, it might well be the eradication of poverty. But that is one really needs to understand what that means for you, for it to become real. And what you have to give up, give away, compromise to be able to achieve this purpose is the big challenge. But that takes time. And as we rush through our lives, and I now want to reflect on an engagement that I was involved in during COVID-19 period, and there were a number of them that I was involved in, and one in particular, the prickly situation around liquor and the unbanning of liquor on the 1st of June. Leading up to that was a great involvement, and I say the word involvement because it has become quite evident that it wasn't a collaboration of industry, government, and industry inclusive of small-scale taverners, not just big industry, to work with government to agree a set of guidelines that the industry would follow to ensure or to try and work towards reducing the impact of the overconsumption of alcohol. And it was a big effort that went into that, and a lot of interaction with the various government, the Department of Trade and Industry, and the Liquor Board, etc. And the disappointing thing was that on the Sunday that the president announced that the liquor would be banned, there was no reference to that collective that had worked together to bring about a set of guidelines that the industry would adhere to along with government. And I think that that type of action does not lead to the trust building that we need. And I hasten to add that there's no doubt in my mind that industry has done exactly the same thing. Unions have done the same thing. Civil society has done the same. This is not a finger-pointing exercise. This is the principle, I believe, that needs to be very, very carefully considered and worked on, is to build the trust. Because only then are we able to move forward and improve our society, which is a complex mix of different systems. As soon as you focus on one part of a system, you don't improve the entire system, and therefore you failed. So for me, the way forward, I honestly believe that, and in my talk, I made reference to the type of leadership that's needed. Courageous leadership, activist leadership, leadership that is not afraid to acknowledge the faults of the past, is not afraid to acknowledge the mistakes, because yes, this is bigger than an individual, organization, or person. I see you appear at Sekani, which means I have to stop. So I will obey you and I will stop.
Yes, that's the code word. That's
absolutely right. I understand.
But thank you so much. I mean, your responses is very easy to just get absorbed. Listening to you, you are a true provocateur in this webinar. We have some few minutes, maybe 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes that I've been allowed as a facilitator, and I would like to ask Professor Thuli Madonsela to just try to respond to the question by Wingfield, if you can see it. That question builds on the last comment or input from Kevin on the way forward in terms of how do we, we need to change the way how we build trust and all that, and he made use this excellent example of government and the private sector discussing and not acting on what they both agreed. So Wingfield is asking, to what extent should we focus our attention away from business and government-based intervention to rather focus on ground up, not the NGO, I mean from the grassroots going up. Grassroots-based, decentralized attempts at dealing with issues. I see they say Wingfield says hunger, but other issues as well. So how do we turn the paradigm? Professor Thuli, briefly in a minute.
And thank you, Doug. What a privilege. Winfred, you're asking the right question about how do we bring people to the party. But firstly, we can't do without government. We're such a big country. Even small countries need government, and sadly, government has to be at the center. Bringing people, I would say that education. From the social justice chair, we have a project called the SCOPRA, whose ideal is to mobilize everyone to be involved, to be the eyes and ears of the people in terms of how decisions are made and where the food is going, where the money is going, and things like that. But on a much broader level, shouldn't we have at this stage an insistence that there should be a parliamentary reopening, given the fact that government has said everything else should operate, because Parliament is the best structure to have these conversations. And that's number one. The second thing, possibly a COVID-19 summit, which is open to every business and is organized by government. Because the difficulty in the way government has been talking at this stage is every group speaks to government separately. And therefore an agreement with one group can be nullified by a subsequent discussion with another group. Whereas if everyone is on the same table, we can make agreements. The truth is we do need to agree fast. And Kevin O'Brien is right. And the UN Secretary General said we either stand together or fall apart. As a nation, we're falling apart, and we're not the only nation that is falling apart because there's too much suspicion, there's too many walls between us. And I do think let's talk, let's put our common purpose forward, let's have confident leadership, and let's turn this losing streak into a winning streak. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful input. Thank you so much. I want to just reinforce that the agency around agreeing fast, as a nation, it's so urgent. I'll use an example yesterday of a very emotive experience that I heard. Living in a country of Africans that are guided by principles of Ubuntu. But we heard in the media for the first time yesterday that a man has died in an informal settlement in Gauteng, and the man has died of hunger in a community where there are neighbors. He had relatives in the area, but he was found in his shack, dead of hunger. We know that, as statistics, we read of these things from the national statistics and surveys, but that just to be confronted with a case where the community has forgotten the principles of Ubuntu in terms of it shows the magnitude, the impact of the current crisis that we're dealing with, and it's important that we agree fast. On that note, unfortunately, we have to work within a time frame. I want to assure our esteemed participants that I know we did not respond to all the questions as I promised, but going through quickly, I see that the reference around building trust, Stephen Greenberg's question, how do we instill a sense of selflessness? Those are things that were covered mostly in the presentation. How do we deal with issues of access to markets and information? Professor Tuli made a very clear point on the importance of data in informing decision-making and guiding policymakers and all that. But I want us to remember that we do have existing structures, the social justice network, structures such as the Southern African FoodLab, and so on, the M-Plan work that's going on, that we can utilize and leverage. Actually, we should leverage on this reinvigorated civil society that is mobilizing action to deal with issues of hunger and the challenges in the food system. I want to take this moment to thank all of you. You've been great, an excellent audience. I want to thank you for the opportunity to facilitate this particular session. Thanks for your contribution and for the interesting debates. Thanks to our presenters, the panel members, for the provocations in their presentations. Scott, I'll hand back to you to give a summary and take the work forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sekani. So it does fall to me just to try and summarize the last 90 minutes. It is, I think, an impossible task to do in 2 or 3 minutes. So I will make 4 points. The first is that this has been an opportunity to hear from people that have acted what they speak, that it's been frank and it's open and it's beyond easy language. It's beyond perhaps some of these words that people hide behind, that it is real. And I think that is inspiring in many ways. So that's the first point. The second is that the concept, the idea of social justice and the commitment to social justice that embraces humility and humanity is a very real thing in order to address food insecurity, hunger, nutrition questions, that it takes us beyond technical solutions. It cracks open the food security definition and helps us to think beyond agriculture or social development, or these simple sectoral responses, but to think about it holistically. And I think that point came through very powerfully. It was linked to the idea of also the role of democracy in food systems. So rather than arguments around localization, which I think are proliferating, as my colleague Stephen Greenberg reminds us, why are we not talking about democratic systems? I think that's a very interesting and important concept. So that was the second point. The third resonates in terms of what got us here. How is the past so embedded in the present in terms of the injustices, the underpinnings of a food system that is so clearly failing? And it was created by hierarchies and control and planning and direct exploitation. So why are we then using those same structures in terms of the state or the private sector or others to try and then solve it? When we heard from both Professor Madonsela and Kevin O'Brien in terms of different ways of working, that is purpose-driven networks around in terms of transparency and inclusion. So that's the third point. And the fourth and final point is this whole concept of collaboration. And here I would like to echo some of the arguments that my colleague Colleen Magna and others have made within REALS about how we stretch ourselves within collaboration. And these are ways of working that are beyond perhaps the kind of skilled leadership that we required in terms of top-down solutions, but how we have to live with discomfort and we've got to embrace conflict. So we have to work with people that we don't like, that we don't trust. That's the first. The second is that we can't control and plan it. We can't control and plan the food system. So how do we experiment systemically inside of it to allow different things to emerge and then to scale those as they work? And then the third point within that is that we can't control others. Perhaps we feel we can through perhaps political party slogans and arguments. But in the end of the day, you can only change yourself. So you have to be in the game like Professor Madonsela, like Sekani, and like Kevin. And so with that, I think is an attempt to try and pull it all together. So as we indicated at the beginning, the meeting has been recorded. We're going to stop that now. If you would like to receive this recording, you must let us know. You can let us know via email. You can write to me. Our website was shared with you earlier on. Or you can just take down the details on the invitation in terms of being able to access us. You need to let us know if you'd like to be invited to more events like this. They're slightly different. They are about provocation. They're bringing thought leaders into a domain and then trying to be provocative. And if any of you would like to stay on a little while longer, you're most welcome. And our colleagues from the Development and Alumni Relations Division will stay on as well. And I will hand over to them. But just to wish you all a very good night and to thank again Dr. Sekani Ngomani for wonderful chairing and facilitation, Professor Thuli Madonsela and Mr. Kevin O'Brien for your honesty and your provocation. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Cheerio, everybody. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Prof. Thuli. Thank you, Tsakani, and to everybody, our guests, our alumni, our friends of the university, and our donors, and everybody who's just joined in this evening. It was a great discussion. I'm Sean Stewart, Alumni and Donor Relations Manager. So you'll see on the screen that you can keep in touch with us through the various social media channels that we have. Our Facebook link, Facebook at Stellenbosch Alumni. Our Instagram link is up at Marty's Alumni, and of course our Twitter feed. You can also follow us there. These are part of a series of online engagement activities. As Scott indicated, there are many that the faculties and the FoodLab are doing, but we also are partnering with various entities across the university. To address this particular issue, please be advised that we do have our Move for Food campaign. Please support that. If you Google hashtag Move for Food, you will find what we're doing to support food insecurity on our campus, which we know is a national issue. I think Kevin referred to it quite a lot in terms of how we bring society, government, business, and unions together. And this is one way of getting our local community involved in the food insecurity issue. Move for Food, support that, read up what we're doing, and we appreciate you being part of that. For all our other events coming up in August, we know August is Women's Month. Please look out for that on www.martysalumni.com for more information on these and other events. I know for the Faculty of Agri-Science, they actually do have an event planned for the 13th of August around women in industry. I think they can refer to the rooibos industry. So that's a good one to look out for. We have something on entrepreneurship. We also have our SWAN network, which is our Stellenbosch Women's Alumni Network on the 26th of August. And we'll have Marlene Leroux speaking. So please stay in touch. If you're a Marty, our alumni, if you're a friend of the university, you're all welcome. Everybody's welcome, and we really appreciate you being part of our network. So thank you very much, and we look forward to engaging further with you. If there are any questions, you're welcome to ask those to me and the team that is still on the call. But if not, have a good evening further. Bye, Dankie. Thank you very much. Nkosi kakhulu.
Thank you.
Prof. Thuli, I see your hand is up. Is there anything that you would like to ask, I suppose?
Yes, well, just to say, I'm sorry, this issue should have been discussed whilst everyone was still on board. When we said food revolutions are caused by hunger, hunger and brains go together. So, and if you think about food, Thismas Foley, they actually started with food issues at universities, hunger and homelessness, and then it escalated to fees. And COVID-19 has made more students desperate for food. Those who didn't have food issues, they were working at restaurants before. And with restaurants closing in many cities, including our student town, Stellenbosch, the food problem is going to become more and more of a challenge. Some students have already indicated that now that they can't do any waitressing, they're struggling to make ends meet. So Move for Food needs to be supported, and it's a pity most people have gone, and I apologize that I also forgot to put it in my slide.
Thank you for raising that. Yes, we also should have said it in the beginning, but yeah, it is a very real issue. Thank you.
You're welcome.
But it's quite possible for us to continue this in terms of engagement with the participants, in terms of a message that goes out to thank everyone for participating. And perhaps we can just link it then with a clear link to somewhere where they can read up about it.
That's wonderful.
Exactly.
That's wonderful.
And Prof. Tuli, absolutely. And I think Annika will liaise on that, because we always want to make sure that the thank you gets out to people. And I think that will be absolutely valuable to include. Thank you.
Wonderful.